The hum of the old Singer sewing machine was the only sound that broke the suffocating silence of the small rented house, a sound that once meant creation and income, but now only echoed the ghost of a life that was gone. At 48, Helen's hands moved over worn fabric not to create, but to keep from screaming. 6 months. 6 months since John was gone. 6 months of watching their savings, painstakingly gathered over 2 decades, evaporate into a black hole of hospital bills and late fees. She felt a familiar cold ache in her chest, a hollow space that grief had carved out and that fear was now filling. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the letter on the table, its formal, stark font a mockery of her pain. The paper felt brittle, official, and unnaturally cold. An eviction notice, a 15-day deadline. The machine's hum faltered and died, plunging the room into a silence that was heavier, more final than before. She felt a gnawing emptiness in her stomach, a hunger not just for food, but for any scrap of hope. A single tear, hot and silent, dripped onto the needle plate, a tiny, glistening offering to her despair. Helen looked towards the small adjoining room where her son, Luke, was supposed to be studying. He was 16, a boy forced to carry the weight of a man's grief on his slender shoulders. She could hear the faint, restless tapping of his fingers on his desk, a staccato rhythm that mirrored the frantic beating of her own heart. A wave of guilt washed over her, hot and suffocating. What kind of future was this? A life of uncertainty, of whispers about money, of watching his mother's face grow tighter with each passing day. The thought made nausea rise in her throat. She had failed him. She had failed John's memory. Luke was a good kid, quiet and observant, trying so hard not to be a burden. He never complained about the simple meals, about the second-hand clothes, about the palpable tension that had settled over their home like a permanent, choking fog. But she saw it in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. The fear, the same cold, creeping fear that kept her awake at night, staring at the cracked ceiling and counting the seconds until a dawn she dreaded. Her love for him was a fierce, protective fire, but it felt like a flickering candle against a hurricane. Her gaze fell upon the worn leather wallet on the kitchen counter. It was John's. She couldn't bring herself to use a new one. Inside was the last of her severance pay from the factory, the final buffer between her family and the street. Her hands, calloused from years of needle and thread, shook as she pulled out the stack of bills. She laid them out on the scarred wooden table, smoothing each one with a reverence reserved for holy relics. 10 $20 bills, 28 $100 bills. She counted them 3 times, her lips moving silently, as if the act of counting could somehow change the total. $3,000. The number felt both impossibly large and laughably small. It was everything she had in the world, the sum total of her husband's life and her own years of labor, reduced to a small, fragile stack of paper. It had to be enough. It had to be enough to find a new home, pay a deposit, and buy them a few more weeks of survival. It had to be. A single, hot tear escaped and splashed onto a bill, darkening Andrew Jackson's face. She quickly wiped it away, the moisture feeling cold and final against her skin. The library's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sterile, buzzing sound that made her head ache. The smell of old paper and floor polish filled her nostrils, a scent she usually found comforting, but today it felt like the smell of decay. She couldn't afford internet at home anymore. It was a luxury cut months ago. Her fingers, more accustomed to the feel of silk and cotton, fumbled clumsily with the public computer's sticky mouse. She scrolled through endless listings for apartments and small houses, her heart sinking lower with each click. Credit check required. First and last month's rent plus security deposit. Proof of stable income. The digital words were like a series of heavy doors slamming shut in her face. A feeling of vertigo washed over her as the screen blurred, the neat columns of text swimming before her tear-filled eyes. Her world had become a prison of numbers and requirements she couldn't possibly meet. The $3,000 she clutched in her mind felt like sand slipping through her fingers. Every listing was a silent, digital judgment, a reminder of her inadequacy, of her fall from a life of simple, hard-won stability into this terrifying freefall. Her stomach twisted into a tight knot of raw panic. The 2-week deadline from the eviction notice felt like a clock ticking inside her own chest, each second a hammer blow of fear. Just as she was about to surrender to the crushing weight of hopelessness, her eyes raw and burning from the screen, A strange listing caught her attention. It was buried deep in a classified site, under unconventional properties. The title was simple: Rustic Houseboat for Sale. The location was a remote bayou in Louisiana, a place she could barely place on a map. The photos were grainy, low-resolution images that showed more shadow than detail, but they hinted at a quaint wooden structure floating on calm, dark water. The description was sparse, speaking of a quiet life and no more rent. Then her breath hitched in her throat. She saw the price: $3,000. Exactly. It felt like a sign, a single ray of light cutting through the oppressive darkness. A desperate, fragile hope began to bloom in her chest, a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. A life on the water, away from landlords and eviction notices, a place she could own, a place for her and Luke to start over. It was a wild, reckless gamble, but what other choice did she have? Her life was already in ruins. What more was there to lose? If you've ever been pushed to the edge, with nothing left but a single, desperate choice, you know this feeling. Subscribe now to find out what terrors and treasures lie waiting for Helen in the murky waters of the bayou. The click of the mouse was unnervingly loud in the library's quiet hum. It was a sound of absolute finality, a digital guillotine severing Helen from her last tangible connection to her old life. $3,000. Transferred. Gone. She felt a strange lightness in her head, a dizzying sense of unreality, as if she were watching a stranger make this catastrophically reckless decision. For a moment, the screen blurred, and all she could see was John's face, his kind eyes, and she felt a fresh wave of grief so powerful it almost buckled her. But beneath the grief, a tiny, desperate seed of hope had been planted. A houseboat, a new life. It had to work. She closed her eyes, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the desk. She whispered a silent prayer into the stale, air-conditioned space, a prayer for a miracle she no longer believed in, but desperately needed. The electronic receipt on the screen was their new birth certificate, or their death warrant. Only time would tell which one it was. She tried to paint the picture for Luke later that evening, her voice artificially bright, straining to project a confidence she was a million miles from feeling. She described the charming houseboat, the tranquil bayou, the freedom of not having a landlord breathing down their necks. She spoke of a new beginning, a real adventure. Luke listened quietly, his 16-year-old face a careful, unreadable mask. He sat at the kitchen table, pushing a cold pea around his plate, his eyes fixed on the worn linoleum floor. He didn't question her, didn't argue. He just nodded, offering a small, tight smile that didn't come close to reaching his haunted eyes. Helen felt her heart ache with a terrible love and guilt. He knew she was terrified. He knew this was a leap of faith off a crumbling cliff, and his silence was both a gift of trust and a heavy, unspoken burden on her already weary soul. His quiet acceptance made her even more determined to make this gamble pay off, to turn this desperate lie into a livable truth. The bus groaned its way south, a metal beast swallowing mile after endless mile of concrete highway. For 2 days, their world shrank to the confines of a sticky vinyl seat and a grimy window. The air inside was thick and recycled, smelling of cheap disinfectant, processed food, and the faint, sour scent of too many people trapped in too small a space for too long. Helen's body ached with a deep, weary stiffness she hadn't felt in years. She watched the familiar landscapes of her home state blur and dissolve, replaced by the flat, monotonous scenery of the deep south. Each mile marker they passed felt like another anchor to her past being cut away, leaving them more and more adrift. She felt a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety in her veins, a current of fear that ran just beneath the surface of her forced composure. Luke slept for long stretches, his head resting against the vibrating glass, his lanky frame folded uncomfortably into the seat, his face slack with a youthful exhaustion that tore at her heart. This journey was a pilgrimage into the unknown, fueled by the last fumes of their savings and a hope so fragile it felt like glass. Helen would stare out the window for hours, her own reflection a ghostly, transparent face superimposed over the passing fields and run-down towns. She felt like a ghost herself, haunting the space between a life that had ended and one that had not yet begun. Was she running toward a new home or just running away from a final, humiliating defeat on the streets? The The question looped in her mind, a merciless mantra timed to the rhythmic thud of the tires on the pavement. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach every time she thought of the grainy, ambiguous photos from the online ad. She tried to push the doubt away, forcing herself to imagine the gentle rocking of the water, the sound of birds, the peace. But the fear was a persistent, cold passenger sitting right beside her, whispering of ruin and failure. They stepped off the bus in a small, forgotten Louisiana town and were immediately enveloped by a wall of oppressive humidity. The air was a thick, wet blanket, heavy with the smells of damp soil, blooming jasmine, and an underlying pervasive scent of sweet decay. It was the smell of a world saturated with life and death, all at once. The sounds were a jarring symphony of the unfamiliar, the deafening, high-pitched buzz of cicadas, the throaty croak of unseen frogs, the distant, mournful cry of a bird she couldn't name. The bus station was little more than a dusty, dilapidated shack with a rusting tin roof. A single taxi, a beat-up sedan with a cracked windshield, sat waiting. The driver, a weathered man with skin like tanned leather and eyes that seemed to have seen everything, barely spoke. He simply loaded their 2 worn suitcases into the trunk and looked at them with an expression that was not quite pity, but something close to it, a weary understanding that made Helen's skin crawl. The drive was short but transformative. The cracked pavement of the town's main street quickly gave way to a potholed county road, which then dissolved into a narrow dirt track flanked by a dense, suffocating wall of cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. The world outside the taxi windows became a blur of menacing green and brown, the late afternoon sun barely penetrating the thick canopy above. The driver navigated the muddy ruts with a practiced ease, his silence growing heavier with every turn. Helen felt her carefully constructed hope begin to fray at the edges. This wasn't rustic, it was desolate. The isolation was a palpable thing, a weight pressing in on the car. Luke stared out his window, his face pale, his earlier silence now charged with a visible tension. When the taxi finally skidded to a halt at the edge of a muddy, overgrown clearing, the driver simply pointed a calloused finger towards a break in the reeds. "There she is," he rasped, his voice gravelly. He took her last $20 bill and, without another word, turned the car around and disappeared, the sound of his engine fading into the unnerving quiet of the bayou. And there it was. Helen and Luke stood on the marshy bank, the mud sucking at their worn-out shoes, and stared. The single, fragile thread of hope that had pulled her all this way snapped with a sickening, silent finality. The rustic houseboat was not just old. It was a skeleton, a wreck, a rotting carcass being slowly devoured by the black and unmoving water of the bayou. The charming home from the low-resolution photos was a cruel joke, a distorted memory of something that might have existed decades ago. What stood, or rather listed before them, was a splintered, algae-covered ruin. Her breath hitched in her throat, a dry, painful gasp. A wave of vertigo washed over her, so intense she had to grab Luke's arm to keep from falling to her knees in the mud. The silence of the bayou pressed in, broken only by the buzzing of mosquitoes and the faint, mocking lap of water against the decaying hull. This wasn't a home, it was a grave. The wood of the hull was not just weathered, it was spongy and dark with rot, whole sections crumbling away into the murky water. The roof on the port side had completely collapsed inward, creating a gaping wound that exposed the dark, damp interior to the elements. The entire structure was listing at a perilous angle, looking as if a strong gust of wind would be enough to capsize it completely and send it plunging to the bottom of the stagnant backwater. The charming porch railing shown in the advertisement was gone, replaced by a few jagged, splintered posts. The windows were either shattered or boarded up with mismatched pieces of wood. It was moored far from anything that resembled a community, a lone, decaying monument to abandonment in a forgotten corner of the world. Helen felt a cold dread, colder than any winter night she had ever known, seep into her bones. This was it. The bottom. They had spent every last cent to arrive at a place far worse than the street they had been trying to escape. A powerful, gag-inducing stench rose from the water and the boat itself, a foul combination that assaulted her senses and made her stomach churn. It was the smell of years of neglect. The sharp, acrid odor of pervasive mold and mildew mingled with the smell of stagnant, oxygen-starved water and the wet, earthy rot of decaying vegetation. It was the smell of things dying slowly, of life being choked out by dampness and darkness. As they cautiously approached the unstable gangplank, the smell intensified, catching in the back of her throat. Helen had to cover her nose and mouth with the collar of her shirt, her eyes watering. Luke did the same, his face a grimace of disgust. The smell was more than just unpleasant. It felt toxic, a warning from the ruin itself, a physical manifestation of the colossal mistake she had made. The air was so thick with it, she felt as if she were breathing in the decay itself. With a heart made of lead, Helen forced her legs to move, testing the gangplank with one foot. It groaned in protest but held. She took a step, then another, her body rigid with tension. The deck of the houseboat felt soft and spongy under her feet, yielding with an alarming give. Every step was a gamble. She felt Luke's hand on her back, a small, steadying pressure in this world of instability. The sound of their footsteps on the rotten wood was dull and sickening, a thudding echo in the oppressive silence. She reached the doorway, its frame warped and hanging from a single rusted hinge. Peering into the gloom beyond, she saw only shadows and the glint of dampness on every surface. A small rat, disturbed by their presence, scurried from a pile of debris in the corner and disappeared through a hole in the floor, its tiny claws making a scratching sound that scraped against Helen's raw nerves. The feeling of absolute despair was so overwhelming, it was physical, a crushing weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe. The interior was even worse than the outside had promised. The main cabin was a chaotic mess of sodden, collapsed furniture, moldy debris, and a thick layer of grime that coated everything. The air was cold and clammy, despite the suffocating humidity outside. Water dripped steadily from the hole in the roof, pooling on the warped floorboards and feeding the colonies of black and green mold that crept up the walls like a grotesque tapestry. The small kitchenette area was a horror of rusted metal and filth. The place had clearly been ransacked and then abandoned to the elements for a very long time. Helen felt a single and hot tear of pure rage and despair trace a path through the dust on her cheek. She had been scammed, defrauded of the last dollar she had in the world, and lured into this death trap. She had not just failed her son, she had actively led him into a situation more dangerous and hopeless than she could have ever imagined. The last ember of her fighting spirit was extinguished by the cold, damp reality of the ruin. Luke, ever the pragmatist, moved past her into the gloom, his footsteps splashing in the shallow puddles on the floor. He went to the hatch that supposedly led to the lower hull, the basement mentioned in the ad. It took both their efforts to heave the swollen wooden panel open. The moment they did, the putrid smell of stagnant water intensified tenfold, rushing up to meet them like a foul breath from the earth. They peered down into absolute blackness. Luke clicked on the small flashlight from his keychain, its weak beam cutting through the dark. The light revealed not a basement, not a storage area, but a dark, flooded tomb. The lower half of the boat was permanently submerged in at least 3 feet of black, oily water filled with floating debris. The sight was the final confirmation. The houseboat was not just listing, it was sinking. Slowly, inexorably, it was being reclaimed by the bayou. It was utterly unsalvageable. A wave of nausea so profound it made her vision swim rose in Helen's throat. Her legs finally gave out, and she sank onto the filthy, damp floor, heedless of the grime. The full weight of their situation crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. They were stranded, completely and utterly stranded. They had no money, not even enough for a bus ticket back to a city where they were now homeless. They had no food beyond the few snacks in their bags. They had no shelter. Only this sinking, toxic wreck, moored in an isolated swamp hundreds of miles from anyone they knew. The silence of the bayou was no longer just quiet, it was predatory. She could feel the vast, indifferent wilderness surrounding them, watching them. The buzzing of the insects sounded like a jeering laugh. Her body began to tremble, an uncontrollable shivering that started in her core and radiated outward. It was the shock, the terror, the grief, all culminating in a complete and total system failure. She looked at Luke. His face, illuminated by the faint light from the doorway, was stripped of all its youthful hope. In its place was a stark, adult fear. He looked back at her, his expression a mixture of terror for their situation and a heartbreaking concern for her. He was trying to be strong for her. and the effort was painfully visible. That look shattered what was left of Helen's composure. A sob, raw and ragged, tore from her throat. It was a sound of pure animal despair, the carefully constructed dam of her emotions, which had held back 6 months of grief and mounting panic, finally broke. The tears came in a hot, unstoppable flood, pouring down her face and dripping onto her dirty hands. She was no longer just crying for her dead husband, or for their lost home, or for the stolen money. She was crying for this final, crushing defeat. She had tried to fight, and she had lost in the most absolute way imaginable. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows through the trees that made the bayou feel even more menacing. The world outside the wrecked cabin dissolved into a palette of deep purples and inky blacks. The chorus of unseen creatures grew louder, a wild alien symphony that highlighted their complete isolation. Here, in this rotting hulk, with no money, no communication with the outside world, and no hope, Helen finally understood the true meaning of being at the bottom. This was not a setback, this was the end of the line. The quiet desperation of their rented room seemed like a distant, unreachable luxury now. A cold, heavy certainty settled in her heart. They were trapped in the dark, in the damp, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing and no one to turn to. A profound hopelessness, bleak and total, washed over her, and for the first time in her life, she felt the will to go on simply drain away. The night fell like a black velvet shroud, suffocating and absolute. For hours, Helen had remained on the floor, a hollowed-out vessel of despair, while the bayou's alien orchestra rose to a deafening crescendo. It was Luke who finally moved. He couldn't stand the sight of his mother's vacant, staring eyes, the slow, silent tears carving paths through the grime on her cheeks. He found an old plastic bucket amidst the debris, its handle cracked but intact. Without a word, he lowered it into the flooded hull, the splash echoing like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. He began to bail, the rhythmic slosh and pour a desperate act of defiance against the inevitable. It was a pointless, absurd task, like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon, but it was something. It was an action. The cold, foul-smelling water slopped over his hands and onto his jeans, but he barely noticed. His movements were mechanical, driven by a 16-year-old's furious refusal to surrender completely to the dark. Helen heard the splashing, and it slowly penetrated the thick fog of her misery. She watched her son, his thin frame silhouetted against the gaping doorway, performing this futile labor. His back was straight, his jaw set. He was not giving up. A fierce, painful surge of love, so potent it felt like a physical blow, jolted her from her stupor. How could she let him face this alone? She pushed herself up, her joints protesting, her muscles screaming. Her body felt alien, a heavy, unresponsive thing. She stumbled towards him, her resolve a tiny, flickering flame in the vast darkness of her soul. She didn't speak. There were no words for this. She simply found a dented metal pot and joined him, plunging it into the black water. Together, they established a grim rhythm. Scoop, lift, heave, pour. The water they threw onto the deck simply seeped back through the rotten floorboards. They both knew it was useless, but the shared, mindless action became a strange, unspoken prayer, a mantra against the encroaching madness. For what felt like hours, they worked in near-total silence. The only sounds the sloshing of water, their own ragged breathing, and the steady, maddening drip from the collapsed roof. The stench from the flooded hull was overpowering, a thick gumbo of rot and stagnation that coated the back of their throats. Helen's arms began to burn with an exhaustion that went bone deep, each lift of the heavy pot a fresh wave of agony. But she kept going, her eyes fixed on Luke's back. They were a team again, not just a mother and son adrift in grief, but partners in a desperate, last-ditch struggle. The physical pain was a welcome distraction from the emotional torment, a sharp, clean feeling that anchored her in the present moment. The act of bailing water into the sinking boat became a kind of penance, a way to punish herself for the catastrophic decision that had led them here. It was a silent apology to her son for her failure, paid in sweat and aching muscles under the indifferent gaze of the Louisiana moon. Luke paused to catch his breath, his chest heaving. He leaned against the hatchway, shining his weak keychain flashlight into the flooded compartment to gauge their utterly non-existent progress. The beam, thin and watery, danced across the surface of the black water, reflecting off floating bits of debris. But as he swept the light across the floor of the hull, something caught his eye. It was a section of the wooden planking near the far wall, just above the waterline. While every other surface was coated in a thick, slimy layer of dark green and black algae, this one small rectangular area was clean, not just clean but seemingly dry, as if it repelled the dampness that saturated everything else. His heart gave a strange, curious flutter. It was an anomaly, a single jarring note in the symphony of decay. It made no sense. He felt a prickle of unease that was different from the raw fear he'd been feeling all evening. This was the cold, sharp thrill of a puzzle. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Come look at this." Helen dragged herself over, her body screaming in protest. She squinted, following the weak beam of Luke's light. She saw it immediately. A perfect rectangle of wood, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, starkly different from the filth-caked planks around it. It looked newer, the grain of the wood still visible, untouched by the slime and rot that had claimed the rest of the boat's underbelly. A flicker of something, not hope, it was too early for that, but intense curiosity cut through her exhaustion. "What is it?" she breathed, the words forming a small cloud in the damp air. It was wrong. It didn't belong. In a place where every inch was surrendering to the slow, wet ravages of time, this one piece seemed to be resisting. Luke scrambled down, his sneakers slipping on the slimy boards, and crept closer to it. He ran his fingers over the surface. It was smooth, sealed, and utterly out of place. He pushed at it, but it didn't budge. It was fixed solid, or so it seemed. Upon closer inspection, they saw the glint of metal. 4 screw heads, one in each corner, were set flush with the wood. But these were not the ancient, rusted fasteners they saw elsewhere on the boat. These were different. Luke aimed the light directly at one. It was a Phillips head screw, its metallic surface still showing a faint silver sheen beneath a thin layer of grime. The other screws holding the hull together were old, rusted flatheads. A cold shiver, sharp and electric, ran down Helen's spine. This was deliberate. Someone had cut a piece of the floor out and sealed it back in with modern hardware. This was not part of the original construction. This was a modification, a secret. The exhaustion in her limbs was replaced by a surge of adrenaline, a frantic energy born of mystery. "We need to get it open," she said, her voice a low, urgent command. The futility of bailing water was forgotten, replaced by a singular, obsessive purpose. Their search for a tool was frantic. They rummaged through the debris in the main cabin, their hands scrabbling in the dark and the filth. Luke's fingers closed around a piece of cold, heavy iron. It was a tire iron, miraculously left behind, its surface pitted with rust but still solid. It wasn't a screwdriver, but it was leverage. He scrambled back down into the hull, Helen right behind him, her earlier fear now eclipsed by a desperate need to know what lay beneath that strange, clean plank. Luke wedged the tip of the tire iron under the edge of the wood and pushed. The wood groaned, but the screws held fast. "It's no good," he grunted, the effort straining his voice. "We have to get the screws out." Helen's mind, honed by years of intricate sewing and repair work, saw a solution. She took the tire iron from him, positioned the flattened end into the Phillips head slot, and then found a heavy, palm-sized rock. With a deep breath, she began to tap the end of the iron, trying to force the screw to turn. Tap, scrape, tap, scrape. The sound was deafening in the silence. It was slow, agonizing work. Her hand, more accustomed to the delicate guidance of a needle, was clumsy and sore. The rock was rough, and it scraped her palm. But with each jarring impact, the screw moved, a fraction of a millimeter at a time. It was a battle of wills against rusted metal and stubborn wood. Luke held the flashlight steady, his entire being focused on the tiny point of contact. Sweat beaded on his forehead and dripped into his eyes. After what felt like an eternity, the first screw gave way with a tortured squeal of protest, its threads stripped bare. 3 to go, they worked together, taking turns, their movements becoming more efficient. The air grew thick with the smells of rust, old wood, and their own sweat. The bayou outside seemed to hold its breath, the chorus of insects and frogs fading into a background hum as the drama inside the rotting boat intensified. Each loosened screw was a small victory, fueling their desperate determination. With a final grating shriek, the last screw came free. For a moment, they both froze, breathing heavily, their hearts pounding in their chests. A profound silence descended once more, broken only by the incessant dripping of water. This was it, the moment of truth. Luke handed the tire iron to his mother. She took a deep, shaky breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the cold metal. She wedged the tip under the edge of the plank and pulled. The wood resisted, held fast by a seal of tar or paint. She pulled harder, putting her entire weight into it. Luke joined her, grabbing the other side. Together, they heaved. With a sucking sound and the splintering groan of old wood, the hatch gave way. It was heavier than they expected. They lifted it free and set it aside on the slimy floor. A puff of air, surprisingly dry and stale, washed over their faces. It was the smell of a sealed tomb, of things long hidden from the light and the damp. Luke shone the flashlight into the opening. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the flooded bilge, it was a secret compartment, a cavity about the size of a large suitcase, built into the bottom of the hull. The inside walls were coated with a thick, black, tar-like substance, glistening wetly in the flashlight's beam. It was a meticulously constructed, waterproofed box, a hidden safe concealed within the boat's very structure. And sitting neatly at the bottom of this dark void were 3 metal boxes. They were military-style ammunition cans, their olive-drab paint obscured by a thick layer of rust. They were lined up perfectly, their presence a silent, shocking testament to a deliberate and calculated secret. The sheer incongruity of it was staggering. These solid, purposeful objects hidden within a vessel of pure chaos and decay. 1,000 questions exploded in Helen's mind, but one screamed louder than the rest. What was in those boxes? Getting them out was another ordeal. The opening was narrow, and the boxes were wedged in tightly. Luke had to lie flat on his stomach, his arm stretched down into the dark cavity, his fingers fumbling with the cold, rusted metal handle of the first box. "It's heavy," he grunted, his voice muffled. "Really heavy." Helen grabbed his legs to keep him from sliding into the hole. He pulled and twisted, his muscles straining. With a final, scraping groan of metal against tarred wood, he managed to slide the first box up and out onto the floor. It landed with a solid and definitive thud that seemed to shake the entire houseboat. The weight was unnatural. Helen stared at it, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was far too heavy to be filled with papers or tools. They repeated the process for the other 2 boxes, their bodies aching, their clothes now soaked with bilge water and grime. Finally, all 3 sat before them on the floor of the flooded hull. 3 rusted, silent enigmas. They hauled the boxes up from the hull one by one into the relative dryness of the main cabin. The effort left them breathless, their adrenaline the only thing keeping them from collapsing. They sat on the filthy floor, staring at their discovery, the weak flashlight beam creating long, dancing shadows that made the rusted containers look like ancient, cursed artifacts. The air was electric with a terrifying, unspoken question. For a moment, neither of them dared to touch the boxes. The reality of their situation had been so bleak, so absolute, that this sudden, impossible twist of fate felt like a dream, a hallucination brought on by despair and hunger. Helen could feel her own pulse throbbing in her ears, a frantic drumbeat of fear and a wild, burgeoning excitement that she hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. She looked at Luke. His face, illuminated in the narrow cone of light, was a mask of pure, wide-eyed astonishment. He looked back at her, and in that shared glance the universe seemed to tilt on its axis. "Open it," Luke whispered, his voice cracking. Helen nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She took the tire iron, the piece of scrap metal that had become the key to their destiny. She chose the box on the left and jammed the tip under the rusted latch. She put all her strength into it, leveraging the iron with a grunt of effort. The latch resisted, fused by years of corrosion. For a second she thought it wouldn't open, that their discovery would remain a sealed mystery. Then, with a sudden, violent shriek of protesting metal, the latch snapped open. The sound was shockingly loud, echoing through the derelict cabin and out into the silent bayou. It sounded like a scream. She worked on the second latch, which gave way more easily. With trembling hands, she placed the tire iron on the floor and slowly, cautiously, lifted the heavy lid of the ammo can. It opened with a low, scraping groan. The flashlight beam dipped into the box. Helen's mind, braced for anything, papers, weapons, even something gruesome, could not process what it was seeing. For a long second, there was only confusion. The box was filled with smallest rectangular blocks of a dull yellowish metal, stacked in neat rows. They didn't glitter or shine, not at first. They just sat there, dense and inert, absorbing the light. Luke leaned in closer, his breath held. He reached in and touched one. His fingers recoiled as if burned. "Mom," he breathed, his voice filled with a disbelieving awe. "No way, it can't be." Helen reached in too, her seamstress's fingers, so used to the textures of fabric and thread, closing around the smooth, cool, impossibly heavy block of metal. She lifted it out. It was heavier than any rock or piece of iron of that size had any right to be. In the focused beam of the flashlight, away from the shadows of the box, it came alive. It was gold, a solid bar of pure gold. It shimmered with a soft, deep, buttery luster, a glow that seemed to come from within. It felt ancient, powerful, wow, and utterly, surreally real. The weight of it in her hand was grounding, a solid anchor in a world that had dissolved into chaos. A dizzying wave of vertigo swept over her, but this time it wasn't from hunger or despair. It was the sheer, brain-shattering shock of holding a fortune in her palm. All the pain, the fear, the humiliation of the past few days, the past 6 months, seemed to recede, replaced by a single, overwhelming sensation of disbelief. They had hit the absolute bottom of the world, only to break through the floor and find a hidden treasure. It was the stuff of fiction, of mad dreams. She and Luke just stared at the bar in her hand, then at each other, their faces pale and ghostly in the reflected golden light. With frantic, trembling hands, they tore open the second box. The latches broke with a sharp crack, and the lid flew open. It was the same, row after row of solid gold bars, packed tightly together, a king's ransom lying on the rotting floor of their floating prison. The sight was obscene, magnificent and terrifying all at once. It was too much hope after so much despair. The sudden, violent swing of fortune was almost as painful as the initial blow of their ruin. Helen felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her chest, a sound halfway between a sob and a shriek. She choked it back down, pressing a hand to her mouth. This much gold wasn't a solution. It was a problem. A very big, very dangerous problem. Who hides this much gold in a sinking houseboat in the middle of a swamp? And more importantly, why? The joy of the discovery was instantly tainted by a new and far more specific kind of fear. Then there was the third box. It felt much lighter than the others, and the latches, while rusted, were not as stubbornly fused. Luke pried them open with his fingers. As the lid lifted, a different smell wafted out, not the metallic tang of gold, but the dry, musty scent of old paper and leather. Inside there was no treasure, at least not the glittering kind. Lying on the bottom was a thick, leather-bound book, its cover warped and stained, and a stack of documents tied with a faded ribbon, all wrapped in a sheet of oilcloth. The oilcloth had done its job. The contents, while aged, were mostly dry. Helen's heart, which had been pounding with a wild, golden excitement, now began to beat with a slower, heavier rhythm of dread. She reached in and lifted the leather-bound book. It was a logbook, its pages filled with tight, spidery handwriting. This, she knew with a chilling certainty, was more valuable and infinitely more dangerous than the gold. She untied the ribbon around the documents with fumbling fingers. They were old bank statements, maps of the Louisiana coastline with hand-drawn annotations, and a series of letters. Her eyes scanned the first page of the logbook. The date was from the late 1980s. The writing was a mix of nautical observations, weather reports, and something else. Coded entries, names, schedules. She felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This wasn't just a stash, this was evidence. The gold was the proceeds of a crime, and this book was the story of how it was committed. The thrill of finding the treasure evaporated completely, replaced by the icy grip of mortal fear. They hadn't found a lottery ticket. They had stumbled into a grave. The person who had hidden these boxes had a very good reason to do so, and an even better reason to make sure they were never found. And now, she and Luke had found them. The final piece of the puzzle lay in the last few pages of the logbook. The handwriting became frantic, agitated. It spoke of a betrayal, a final shipment. It mentioned a name, or rather, a title, the Colonel, a powerful, corrupt local businessman who was the mastermind behind it all. The logbook's author, a man named Jean-Luc, was clearly terrified. He wrote of his plan to take this last shipment of gold and disappear before the Colonel could tie up loose ends. The final entry was dated October 17, 1989. It consisted of just 3 words, scrawled hastily across the page: "He is here," and then nothing. The pages that followed were blank. A cold dread, absolute and suffocating, descended upon Helen. Jean-Luc never escaped. The gold in the first 2 boxes was his intended getaway fund, and this boat wasn't just his hiding place, it was likely his tomb. They weren't just trespassing, they were squatting in a 30-year-old crime scene. Helen looked at the gold essay and then at the logbook in her hands. The shimmering bars no longer looked like salvation, they looked like bait. They were proof of a massive crime, a heist, a murder, and a motive for more. The Colonel, or whoever he was now, would never stop looking for this. The man who had sold her the boat, taken her last $3,000, was he just a random scammer? Or was he part of something much larger? Had he known or suspected? The questions swirled in her mind, a vortex of paranoia and fear. The isolation of the bayou, which had earlier been a symbol of their abandonment, now felt like a trap. They were alone out here, with a fortune in stolen gold and the evidence of a murder, miles from civilization, with no way to call for help. The buzzing of the cicadas outside no longer sounded indifferent. It sounded like a warning. She carefully rewrapped the logbook and the documents in the oilcloth and placed them back in the 3rd box, closing the lid with a soft, final click. She looked at Luke, whose face was a mirror of her own dawning horror. The elation was gone, replaced by the grim understanding of their new predicament. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper that defied the trembling in her hands. The immediate problem of survival, of shelter, of food, was suddenly dwarfed by a much more menacing threat. They were no longer just victims of a scam. They were keepers of a deadly secret. They had to get away, not just from the sinking boat, but from the long, dark shadow of the crime they had just unearthed. The mystery of the clean plank of wood had been solved, but it had opened a Pandora's box of danger that threatened to swallow them whole. The gold bars sat in their open boxes, emanating a faint, sinister glow in the darkness. They were a tangible link to a violent past, a past that suddenly felt very much alive. Helen imagined the Colonel, a shadowy figure of immense power, and the ruthlessness it would take to orchestrate a crime of this magnitude and silence those involved. Was he still out there? Or had his empire, built on this stolen fortune, been passed down to a new generation? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. The name on the deed of sale for the houseboat was a generic LLC she hadn't bothered to research. A cold, sickening realization washed over her. The online ad, the exact price, the low-resolution photos designed to obscure the boat's condition. It wasn't just a scam to get her money. It was a lure. Someone wanted this boat occupied, perhaps to see what might be flushed out. They had been set up from the very beginning. They quickly put the lids back on the 2 boxes of gold, the metallic clang echoing the finality of their discovery. The treasure was now a burden, its weight both physical and psychological. Luke looked at his mother, his eyes asking the question she had no answer for. What do we do now? They couldn't leave the gold. It was their only leverage, their only hope of escaping not just the bayou, but the poverty that had driven them here. But they couldn't take it all. The sheer weight would make any escape impossible. They were trapped by their own good fortune. Helen's mind raced, sifting through the impossible options. The nearest town was miles away, and they had no transportation. To walk through the swamp at night would be suicide. For now, they were prisoners on this rotting boat, guardians of a treasure that could either save their lives or get them killed. With a shared sense of urgency, they decided to re-hide the boxes. Leaving them in the open felt like an invitation to disaster. Working together, they laboriously lowered the 2 heavy boxes of gold back into the secret, tar-lined compartment. The thud as they landed in the darkness below was a somber, definitive sound. But Helen hesitated with the third box, the one containing the logbook and documents. This was different. The gold was wealth, but this was power. This was the truth. Leaving it behind was unthinkable. She clutched the cold metal box to her chest, as if it were a life raft. This was their story to tell, their only weapon against the faceless, powerful enemy they had just inherited. The mystery of the boat was solved, but a new, far more terrifying mystery had begun. The mystery of how to survive, knowing what they now knew. Luke sealed the makeshift hatch, pushing it back into place. In the gloom, the clean rectangle of wood once again looked innocuous, a strange but dismissible flaw in the decaying hull. But now they knew its secret. The boat held its breath around them, the weight of the hidden gold and the dark story in the logbook pressing down on the very air they breathed. Helen felt a profound shift within herself. The despair and helplessness that had crippled her were gone, burned away by the heat of adrenaline and the cold clarity of imminent danger. She was no longer just a victim. She was a player in a game she didn't understand, holding a hand that was both priceless and deadly. The seamstress from a quiet town was gone, and in her place was a woman with a dangerous secret, a fierce will to protect her son, and a fortune in stolen gold hidden beneath her feet. The bayou was no longer just a swamp, it was an arena, and the game had just begun. The pale, watery light of dawn did little to dispel the oppressive gloom inside the houseboat. The adrenaline of their discovery had curdled into a cold, heavy dread that sat in the pit of Helen's stomach. She and Luke huddled together in the main cabin, the third metal box sitting between them like a time bomb. The air was thick with the stench of mold and the musty scent of the old paper that held a 30-year-old secret of greed and murder. The elation was gone, replaced by the terrifying adult understanding that their discovery was not a ticket to freedom, but a key to a cage they hadn't even known existed. With trembling fingers, Helen unlatched the box again. The gold was a problem for later. This, the story written in faded ink, was the immediate threat. She lifted the leather-bound logbook, its weight feeling heavier now, burdened by the truth it contained. The silence of the bayou seemed to be listening, waiting for them to make their next move. Her voice was a ragged whisper as she began to read excerpts aloud to Luke, the words meant to arm him, to make him understand the true nature of the monster they had awoken. September 14, 1989, she read, her finger tracing the spidery script. The colonel has secured the transport schedule, Route 17 as planned. He says the guards are on the payroll. Complacent. The target is the federal transfer from the New Orleans Mint. He called it a civic redistribution of wealth. The man talks like a politician, but he has the eyes of a snake. The crew is solid. Professionals. I trust them. But I don't trust him. Helen's heart ached for this long-dead man, Jean-Luc. He was a criminal, yes, but in his own words, she could hear the creeping doubt, the first inkling that he was swimming in waters far too deep, with a shark far too powerful. The meticulous planning detailed on the page spoke not of a simple robbery, but a sophisticated conspiracy. She flipped through the brittle pages, the paper crackling in protest. The entries grew shorter, more frantic. October 2nd. Gator is gone. The colonel said he went to Miami to spend his share. I don't believe it. We had an argument about the final split. Gator was loud, impulsive. The colonel doesn't like loose ends. He told me that himself. He said, "A secret is only safe when only one man knows it." He smiled when he said it. I saw his boat near Gator's shack the night before he left. Helen's blood ran cold. The words on the page were a ghost's warning from across the decades. This wasn't just a falling out among thieves. This was a purge. The colonel wasn't a partner. He was a predator, devouring his own accomplices, one by one. Jean-Luc had been documenting his own death sentence, and now that sentence had been passed on to her and Luke. The air in the cabin felt thin, hard to breathe. Beneath the logbook lay the stack of documents, tied with a faded ribbon. These were not letters. They were the anatomy of a corrupt empire. Helen spread them out on the filthy floor, the weak morning light illuminating columns of figures and initials. They were ledgers, meticulously kept, detailing payments. Small but regular sums, $500 here, $1,000 there, listed next to the initials of what could only be judges, police chiefs, and state representatives. It was a roadmap of graft, a 30-year-old portrait of how the colonel had used the stolen gold not just to enrich himself, but to buy the entire system, piece by rotten piece. He had insulated himself with a wall of powerful, compromised men. This discovery was no longer about a simple heist. They had stumbled upon the very foundation of a shadow government, built on stolen federal assets and enforced by murder, on a brittle, yellowed document. A deed transfer for a shell company used to purchase a tract of swampland. She finally saw the full name. It felt like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of her. Colonel Thomas Devereux. The name was no longer a phantom. It was real, attached to a legal document, a tangible link to the monster in the pages of the logbook. The Devereux family, a legacy of crime. Helen felt a wave of nausea. The whole sordid history of this place, this boat, this stolen fortune, was coalescing around that one name. She could almost feel the presence of the man himself, his cold ambition reaching out from the grave. The musty scent of the papers seemed to thicken, carrying the smell of old money, old sins, and the dirt of the graves he had filled. The evil they had uncovered now had a dynasty attached to it. It was mid-morning when a new sound sliced through the humid air, a sound so alien to the natural world of the bayou that it felt like an attack. It wasn't the sputter of a fisherman's outboard motor or the whine of an airboat. It was a deep, powerful, throaty hum, the sound of an expensive, finely tuned engine. It was the sound of wealth and power, and it was getting closer. A jolt of pure terror shot through Helen. "The box!" she hissed. They scrambled, their movements clumsy with panic, shoving the logbook and ledgers back into the ammunition can. Luke slammed the lid shut as Helen heaved the secret hatch open just enough to slide the box back into the dark, tar-lined compartment. They didn't have time to replace the screws. The engine sound was louder now right outside, a low growl that vibrated through the rotten hull of the boat and up into their bones. Through a crack in the boarded-up window, they saw it. A gleaming white Cadillac Escalade, its chrome glittering in the sun, had pulled into the muddy clearing. The vehicle was an obscene declaration of wealth in this forgotten, decaying corner of the world. It was so clean, it looked as if it had materialized out of thin air, untouched by the mud and grime of the track it had just traversed. The engine cut out abruptly, and the ensuing silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was a heavy, expectant silence. Helen held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt Luke press against her back, his own small frame rigid with fear. They were trapped. The boat, which had been their refuge and their prison, now felt like a coffin. The hunter had found their hiding place. The driver's door swung open with a soft, expensive click. A man emerged, and Helen felt a fresh wave of cold fear wash over her. He was in his late 40s, his posture radiating an easy, absolute authority. He wore a crisp, cream-colored linen suit and gleaming alligator-skin shoes, a costume of power utterly at odds with the swampy environment. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his handsome face was a mask of cool, detached appraisal. This was not a man who ever got his hands dirty. He had others for that. He didn't look at the boat immediately. Instead, his gaze swept across the surrounding bayou, a slow, proprietary scan, as if he were inspecting property he already owned. In that moment, Helen knew with bone-deep certainty who this was. This was the legacy. This was Devereux. He moved toward the unstable gangplank, his steps measured and precise, a man picking his way through filth with practiced disdain. He stopped at the water's edge, his cold eyes finally settling on the wreck of the houseboat. A slow smile spread across his face, but it didn't touch his eyes. It was a smile of grim satisfaction, of a long hunt finally reaching its conclusion. He knew. Helen felt a powerful shiver rack her body. There was no way he could know about the gold, not for sure. But his presence here, his smug confidence, told her he had been waiting for this. The ad, the sale, it was all a trap. They had been the bait, and he was here to see what he had caught. His gaze felt physical, as if it were peeling back the rotten planks of the hull, searching for the secret hidden within. "Hello, the house." His voice was smooth, laced with the genteel accent of old Southern money, but it carried an undeniable edge of command. It was not a question, it was a summons. Hiding was no longer an option. He had seen their footprints in the mud. He had likely been alerted by the taxi driver or some other local on his payroll. Taking a deep, ragged breath to steady her nerves, Helen pushed open the broken door and stepped out onto the deck, The sudden sunlight was blinding. She squinted, her body tensing as she faced the man. She could feel Luke right behind her, a silent, terrified presence in the doorway. She was a seamstress, a widow, a mother. She was nothing, he was everything. The power imbalance was a physical chasm between them, as wide and dark as the bayou water. "Ma'am," he began, the word rolling off his tongue with practiced, patronizing charm. He didn't bother to introduce himself. A man like him assumed everyone knew who he was. "Beau Devereaux. My family has certain interests in this part of the state. I was told someone was foolish enough to purchase this floating scrap heap." His eyes, cold and grey as a winter sky, flickered over her, then to the dilapidated structure. "Frankly, it's a dangerous eyesore, and I've been meaning to have it cleared. Still, I admire your tenacity." He paused, his fake smile tightening. "I'm prepared to offer you $500 to relinquish your claim and vacate the property immediately, a gesture of goodwill for your trouble." The offer was a calculated jab, designed to humiliate Itu, to establish dominance from the outset. Every instinct screamed at Helen to take the pittance and run, but then the image of the logbook flashed in her mind, the stolen gold, Gator's disappearance. Jean-Luc's final, terrified entry. This man's father had built an empire on theft and murder, and he stood here now, the smiling heir to it all, trying to buy her silence for pocket change. A cold, hard anger she hadn't felt in years rose up and choked her fear. It was the anger of a woman with nothing left to lose. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his without flinching. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Devereaux," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "But it's not for sale." The lie felt surprisingly natural, a piece of armor she had just forged. "My son and I have decided to make it our home." The shift was instantaneous and terrifying. The mask of the charming businessman dissolved, evaporating to reveal the cold-shut reptilian predator beneath. Beau Devereaux's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed to slits, and the polite facade was replaced by a look of pure, undisguised contempt. "A home," he repeated, his voice dropping to a low snarl. He took a single menacing step onto the gangplank, causing it to groan in protest. His eyes left her and drifted down to the black, stagnant water that lapped against the hull. "You've made a grave error in judgment. This is not a place for you. You have no idea what you're interfering with." The air grew heavy, thick with his unspoken rage and the promise of violence. He was no longer playing a game. He slowly lifted his gaze back to her face, his eyes devoid of any warmth or humanity. His voice was a low, sibilant whisper that was more frightening than any shout. "This bayou, it has a way of swallowing things, ma'am. Boats, secrets, people." He let the words hang in the humid air, each one a drop of poison. Outsiders come here thinking they understand, but they don't. They get lost. They have accidents. He gestured dismissively at the treacherous water around them. "It would be a tragedy if some unfortunate accident were to befall you and that boy of yours, a real shame." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a clear, brutal promise, delivered with the chilling certainty of a man who had made and carried out such promises before. Without waiting for a response, Beau Devereaux turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He walked back to his immaculate Escalade, his posture screaming confidence and impunity. He had delivered his ultimatum and had no doubt it would be enough. The car door slammed shut with the force of a judge's gavel. The powerful engine roared back to life, and the truck spun around, spraying mud as it sped away down the dirt track, vanishing back into the suffocating green. Helen was left standing alone on the rotting deck, trembling not from fear, but from a terrifying mix of rage and adrenaline. The choice laid before her was stark and brutal: run away with nothing, or stay and fight a man who could make them disappear without a trace. What would you do? Would you sacrifice justice for safety, or risk your life for the chance to reclaim what was stolen? Subscribe now, because the storm is coming to the bayou, and Helen is directly in its path. The sound of the Escalade's engine faded, but the silence it left behind was not empty. It was filled with the residue of Beau Devereaux's threat, a toxic vapor that clung to the humid air. Helen's heart, which had been a frantic drum, now beat with a sick, heavy thud against her ribs. Beau's parting words, "Accidents happen," played on a loop in her mind, each repetition colder and sharper than the last. A profound chill settled deep in her bones, a coldness born not of the damp air but of the absolute certainty of his promise. She looked at Luke, whose 16-year-old face was a pale, ashen mask, his eyes wide with a terror that perfectly mirrored her own. The flash of anger that had briefly fortified her was gone, extinguished by a tidal wave of raw fear. She had led them here. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a death sentence she had unwittingly purchased for $3,000. The weight of her failure was a physical force, pressing down on her chest and making each breath a ragged, painful effort. The bayou was no longer a backdrop. It was a conspirator in an evil that now had a name, Devereaux. Just as the suffocating silence threatened to swallow her whole, a new sound reached her ears. It was subtle, almost lost beneath the constant drone of insects. A gentle splash, a soft, rhythmic dip and pull. It was a sound of patient, deliberate movement, a stark contrast to the violent roar of Beau's engine. Helen tensed, every muscle in her body screaming, "Threat!" She pulled Luke back into the shadows of the cabin, her hand clamped over his arm in a vice grip. Her breath caught in her throat. Were they back already? Had he sent someone to finish the job immediately? She peered through the same crack in the boarded window, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest. The sound grew slightly louder, closer. It was the sound of a single paddle or pole, pushing through the thick, dark water with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice. It was not a sound of aggression, but of stealth. And in her current state, stealth was just as terrifying. The water rippled, and a long, thin shadow began to emerge from a curtain of Spanish moss 60 yards away. It was a boat, but a tiny one. The boat was a pirogue, a narrow, flat-bottomed canoe perfectly suited to the shallow, treacherous waters of the bayou. It glided towards them, silent as a ghost. In it stood a single figure, an old man poling it forward with a long cypress branch. He was as weathered and ancient as the swamp itself. His skin was the color and texture of cracked leather, a testament to a lifetime under the Louisiana sun. He wore a stained, sleeveless shirt and tattered overalls, his wiry arms corded with muscle. A wide-brimmed straw hat, frayed at the edges, shadowed a face that was a roadmap of wrinkles. From this distance, Helen couldn't see his eyes, but she could feel his gaze on the houseboat. The smell of the bayou seemed to intensify around him, a mixture of fish, swamp water, and something else. Pipe tobacco, maybe. He was a part of this place, an extension of it, as natural as the cypress knees that broke the surface of the water. He didn't look threatening, but in this new, terrifying reality, she couldn't trust anything or anyone. The old man poled the pirogue directly towards their wreck, his movements unhurried and sure. He didn't call out, he didn't wave. He simply approached, his silence more unnerving than any shout would have been. Helen felt a cold sweat prickle her hairline. Was he a friend of Devereaux, a scout, a local paid to keep an eye on things? Every possibility was a new spike of fear. The pirogue nudged gently against the rotting hull of the houseboat with a soft thud. The man planted his pole into the muddy bottom, anchoring himself. He stood there for a long moment, his shadowed face turned up towards her, a silent, unsettling statue. Helen's mind raced. Should she speak? Should she hide? She felt Luke trembling behind her. The decision was taken from her when the man's voice, a low, gravelly rasp, thick with a Cajun accent, cut through the tension. "That was Beau Devereaux's truck, wasn't it?" he asked. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. He already knew. He had been watching. The realization sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her. Helen forced herself to step back out onto the deck, trying to project a calmness she was a million miles from feeling. "I don't know who you're talking about," she lied, her voice tight and unnatural. She needed to know who this man was, what he wanted. The old man let out a dry, humorless chuckle, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Share," he said, the Cajun term of endearment sounding weary on his tongue. "Ain't but one man around here drive a truck like dat, and he only come out to this forgotten place for one reason, trouble." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the black water, the brown stain spreading slowly. "Name's Thibodeau. Folks call me Pops. I live in dat shack over yonder." He gestured with his chin towards a small hut on stilts barely visible through the trees. Helen felt a knot of dread in her stomach. A neighbor, a witness. But whose side was he on? Her hand instinctively went to the doorframe, her knuckles white. She had to protect Luke. She had to protect the secret beneath their feet. Every word was a potential trap. "We don't want any trouble," Helen said, her voice barely a whisper. The statement was so absurdly inadequate that it sounded pathetic even to her own ears. They were drowning in trouble. Pops Thibodeau studied her face for a long moment, his gaze sharp and surprisingly perceptive from beneath the brim of his hat. He seemed to be weighing her, judging her character. "Trouble ain't something you want, ma'am. It's something the Devereaux give. I seen that shiny truck come out here, and I seen it leave in a hurry. You look like you seen a ghost." He wasn't wrong. She felt like she'd seen something far worse. The old man's directness was disarming. He wasn't playing the same polite, menacing games as Beau. This was a different kind of currency. The blunt truth of a man who had seen too much to bother with lies. A tiny, desperate part of her wanted to trust him, to unload the terrifying burden she was carrying, but fear was a powerful censor. She remained silent, her mind a whirlwind of distrust and desperate calculation. She could feel Luke peeking out from behind her, his fear a palpable presence. Pop sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Look," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I ain't gonna ask what he wanted. I can guess. He probably offered you some chump change for this wreck, didn't he? Told you it was for your own good?" Helen's sharp intake of breath was all the confirmation he needed. He nodded slowly, a grim understanding dawning on his weathered face. "And you got your back up. You told him no. I can see it in your eyes. You got more spine than sense, you." He paused, his gaze becoming serious, intense. "You don't say no to Beau Devereaux, Cher. Not unless you got a powerful good reason, or a powerful fast way to get gone." He looked from her face to the rotting boat, then back again. His eyes narrowed. "What did you find in this old boat? What did Jean-Luc leave behind that Beau wants so bad after 30 years? The name hit her like a physical blow. Jean-Luc. He knew. The world tilted, and the air rushed from her lungs. This old man knew the whole story. Helen's carefully constructed wall of denial crumbled to dust. "Jean-Luc," she repeated, the name tasting like rust and fear in her mouth. You knew him?" Pops Thibodeau's expression softened with a deep, ancient sadness. "Knew him? Yeah. He was my friend, a fool, but a good man underneath it all. Got caught up in something bigger than him. Something greedy." He leaned on his pole, his gaze distant, lost in a memory 30 years old. "He bought this boat, fixed her up real nice. Said he was going to sail down to the islands, to live on the water, but he was always jumpy, always looking over his shoulder." Helen's heart hammered against her ribs. The ghost from the logbook was being given form, flesh and blood, by the words of this old fisherman. The story wasn't just old ink on a page anymore. It was real. It was standing right in front of her, offering a key to what she didn't know, salvation or a deeper grave. She had to know more. She had to take the risk. "What happened to him?" she asked, her voice trembling. Pops's eyes darkened. He scanned the surrounding trees as if the ghosts of the past were still listening. It was a night like any other, back in '89. Storm was brewing out in the Gulf. I was out checking on my crab traps. I see a boat coming in, a fancy one. Not a fishing boat, a big, fast cigarette boat with a powerful engine." He paused, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "So I tied up right where I'm at now, and a man got off. A man in a suit, big man, important. I was hiding in the reeds. I knew to stay clear when men like that come around." Helen gripped the doorframe, her knuckles turning white. She knew who the man was. It had to be the Colonel, Thomas Devereaux, Beau's father. The story from the logbook and the memory of this old man were converging into a single, terrifying point, a moment in time where everything went wrong. The air grew thick with the impending revelation, and Helen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The past was breathing down her neck. "I heard a hem," Pops continued, his voice low. "Jean-Luc and the big man. They was arguing, loud. Jean-Luc, he sounded scared. He kept saying, 'Well, it's my share. We had a deal.' And the other man, his voice was cold, like ice. He wasn't shouting. He was just talking. But his words had a weight to 'em. Their finality." Pop stared at the houseboat, his eyes unfocused, seeing the past superimposed over the present ruin. "The big man, he said something I'll never forget. He said, 'The deal is what I say it is, and I say your part is over.' Then there was a noise, not a gunshot, more of a thud, a splash, then quiet, real quiet, too quiet. Helen felt nausea rise in her throat. The logbook's final entry, "He is here," now had a soundtrack, an argument, a thud, a splash. She was standing on a tomb. Jean-Luc wasn't just missing, he was at the bottom of this black water, his bones tangled in the roots of the cypress trees, his murder witnessed only by this old man who had been too afraid to speak, until now. Pop's gaze snapped back to the present, focusing on Helen with a fierce intensity. The next morning, the fancy boat was gone, and so was Jean-Luc. I never saw him again, but I saw that man, the big man. I saw his picture in the paper years later, with the governor, Colonel Thomas Devereux. He spat the name like a curse. And the man you saw today, that was his son, Beau. He inherited his daddy's money, his daddy's power, and his daddy's poison. That family share. They ain't just criminals, they're butchers. They built their empire on stolen money and dead men. They own the judges, the sheriff, everyone. You cross them, you don't go to jail, you just disappear. Your boat sinks. You have a hunting accident. You're fishing one day and you just never come back. They make problems go away. Permanently. The blunt, brutal truth of his words hit Helen with the force of a physical blow. She staggered back a step, the full scope of her peril finally, horribly clear. For a moment, Helen couldn't breathe. The air was too thick, too heavy with the weight of Pop's story. It wasn't just validation, it was a death warrant. Every paranoid fear she'd had since Beau's visit was not only real but understated. She wasn't dealing with a corrupt businessman. She was facing a dynasty of murderers who had operated with impunity for over 30 years. Her refusal to sell the boat wasn't a brave stand. It was a fatal miscalculation. She had painted a target on her back, and on Luke's. A wave of terror, so pure and absolute it was almost paralyzing, washed over her. Her knees felt weak, and the world seemed to tilt and spin. But beneath the terror, a strange new feeling was taking root, a cold, hard resolve. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a witness. She held the proof in her hands, or rather, under her feet. The logbook wasn't just Jean-Luc's story, it was now her weapon. The only weapon she had against an enemy who controlled everything. The fear was still there, a screaming voice in her head. But now it was accompanied by the quiet, steely whisper of a fight. "He'll be back," Pop said, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. "Beau won't let this go. He knows you're not supposed to be here. He knows you might find something like that threat he made. That wasn't a warning for tomorrow. That was a promise for tonight." The urgency in his voice was a cattle prod. "You and your boy, you can't stay here. When night falls, his men will come, and they won't be coming to talk." He pointed his long, calloused finger at the narrow pirogue. "This ain't much, but she's quiet, and she can go where his big boats can't. I can get you through the back channels, to a dirt road 5 miles from here, but we have to go now. We have to be gone before dark." It was a lifeline, a fragile, desperate chance, to trust this stranger, this old man who had kept a secret for 30 years. But what choice did she have? To stay was certain death. To go with him was a sliver of a chance at life. She looked at Luke, then at the determined, weary face of the old fisherman. "Get your things," Pops commanded. "Only what you can carry, and hurry." The sun bled out of the sky with alarming speed, the brilliant oranges and purples of sunset quickly consumed by the inky, suffocating black of the bayou night. The temperature dropped, but the air remained thick, humid, and alive. The sounds of the swamp transformed. The daytime hum of cicadas was replaced by the deep, guttural croaking of bullfrogs, the high-pitched chirp of crickets, and 1,000 other unseen, unknown things that slithered and crawled and hunted in the darkness. Every snap of a twig, every splash in the water, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Helen's veins. The houseboat, once a symbol of her failure, now felt like a death trap, a flimsy wooden box waiting to be stormed. The tension inside the main cabin was a palpable entity, a living thing that coiled in the shadows and constricted her chest. She and Luke moved in a frantic, whispered silence, their fear a shared, unspoken language. The clock was ticking, and with every passing second, the approaching night felt less like a natural cycle and more like a predator closing in. They had only one bag, Luke's worn school backpack. Pop's words echoed in her mind. Only what you can carry. There was no question of what they needed to take. The gold, the vast, heavy fortune, had to be left behind. It was an anchor, not a life raft, all except for 2 bars. Helen reached down into the secret compartment, her hands closing around the cold, dense metal. She wrapped 2 gold bars in an old rag to muffle any sound and placed them at the bottom of the backpack. They were heavy, a tangible weight of proof. They weren't for wealth. They were for evidence. Then she reverently placed the 3rd ammo can, the one containing the logbook and the ledgers, on top. She zipped the backpack shut, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. She helped Luke put it on, the weight of their potential salvation and their certain doom settling on his young shoulders. He squared them, his face grim and determined. He was no longer a boy. The bayou had stripped that from him in less than 24 hours. They were ready. They were fugitives. They were about to make their way to the back of the boat when the sound started. It began as a low whine in the distance, a high-pitched, angry buzz that cut through the natural chorus of the swamp like a razor. It was not the sound of a car or an outboard motor. It was the distinctive, menacing scream of an airboat. Helen froze, her blood turning to ice. Pops had been right. They were coming. The sound grew louder with terrifying speed, a mechanical hornet's nest bearing down on them through the darkness. There was no stealth in this approach, no subtlety. This was a declaration of force, a blunt instrument of violence meant to terrify and overwhelm. It was the sound of Beau Devereaux making good on his promise, the sound of an empire protecting its secrets. Luke grabbed her hand, his knuckles digging into her skin. The whine became a roar, echoing off the water and the trees, a vortex of sound that seemed to be coming from all directions at once. There was nowhere to run. They were surrounded by the sound, trapped in its path. The roar of the airboat engine was a physical force, vibrating through the rotten floorboards and up Helen's spine. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated aggression, a predator's scream in the dead of night. All doubt, all hesitation, was incinerated in that moment. Pops wasn't just a storyteller. He was a prophet. He had read the signs, interpreted the threat with an accuracy born of 30 years of fear and observation. The memory of Beau's cold smile, his veiled threats, now felt like a child's tantrum compared to this. This was the reality. This was the brutal, efficient machinery of the Devereaux family in motion. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution. Helen felt a surge of cold, clear-headed panic. There was no more time for thought, only for action. The plan Pops had laid out was their only scripture, their only path through the valley of death that was closing in around them. "The back," she whispered to Luke, her voice tight and strained. "Now!" They had seconds, not minutes. The hunters' dogs were at the door. Suddenly, a brilliant, blinding white light sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the water and slamming into the side of the houseboat. It was a powerful floodlight mounted on the airboat, and it turned their world into a stark, terrifying stage of black shadows and overexposed white. The beam cut through the cracks in the walls, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like panicked spirits. Helen and Luke flattened themselves against the floor, their hearts seizing in their chests. The light was a hunter's eye, pinning them, searching for them. It swept past the doorway and then back again, lingering. They could hear rough voices now, men shouting to one another over the deafening roar of the engine. They were close, so close. The light pinned their position, and the feeling of being exposed, of being caught in the crosshairs, was suffocating. It stripped away the cover of darkness, leaving them naked and vulnerable in the face of the approaching violence. The light was a promise of what was to come. No quarter, no escape. The airboat engine sputtered and cut out, and the sudden, shocking silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise. In its place, there was only the lapping of water, the frantic thumping of Helen's own heart, and the heavy, menacing sound of the large vessel drifting into the side of their wreck. A loud, splintering crunch echoed through the cabin as the airboat's metal hull slammed into the houseboat's rotting wood. The entire structure shuddered from the impact, groaning in protest. Helen felt the deck shift beneath her, a sickening lurch that sent a fresh wave of panic through her. They were being boarded. She could hear the scrape of heavy boots on metal, then a solid, heavy thud as someone jumped from the airboat onto their fragile deck. Then another, two of them, at least. They moved with a confidence that spoke of familiarity with violence. They were not here to ask questions. The air grew thick with the smell of gasoline fumes and the faint metallic scent of impending bloodshed. There was no knock, no "hello, the house." Only a single, tremendous thud against the flimsy front door that shook the entire frame. Helen flinched violently, a small cry escaping her lips. It was the sound of a boot, a shoulder, a battering ram. It was a sound of pure, impatient force, a moment of silence, and then another, harder impact. Crack! The wood of the door splintered, the sound sharp and violent in the small space. They weren't trying to open it, they were trying to demolish it. "Open up!" A rough voice snarled from the other side, the words muffled but dripping with menace. "We know you're in there. The boss just wants to talk." It was a lie so blatant it was insulting. Helen could hear another sound now, the metallic scrape of a crowbar being wedged into the doorframe. They were coming in. The flimsy wood and rusted hinges that constituted their only barrier would not hold for more than a few more seconds. Time had run out. The moment of confrontation was here, and their only hope was to not be there when it happened. In that split second, as the doorframe began to groan and splinter, Helen's mind became a shard of ice. The terror was still there, a screaming engine in her core, but it was now overlaid with a powerful primal instinct to survive, to protect her child. There would be no confrontation. Fighting these men was suicide. Pop's plan was everything. She grabbed Luke's arm, her grip iron. "The back window," she mouthed, her eyes wide and urgent. She didn't have to say it twice. Luke, his face a pale mask of terror, but his eyes focused, nodded. He already had the backpack secure. They were a single unit, moving with a desperate, synchronized grace born of mortal fear. They scrambled away from the front of the cabin, their movements silent on the filthy floor, staying low to avoid the searching beams of flashlights that now cut through the cracks in the walls. The sound of splintering wood behind them was a starting pistol, signaling the beginning of a race they could not afford to lose. Every fiber of her being was focused on one thing: escape. A final ear-splitting crack boom echoed through the boat as the front door burst inward, ripped from its hinges and crashing to the floor. The heavy, thudding footsteps of two men entered the cabin. "Check the rooms," one of them barked. "Bo wants the boxes," he said. "Leave no witnesses." The words, cold and clear, confirmed Helen's worst fears. This was not a robbery. It was a clean-up operation. They were loose ends to be tied permanently. A powerful flashlight beam sliced through the gloom, sweeping across the debris-strewn room they had just vacated. Helen and Luke pressed themselves into the deepest shadows at the back of the boat, their breathing shallow, silent. The smell of the men filled the space. Stale sweat, cheap cologne, and something else, something acrid and dangerous. They were predators who had breached the den, and they were sniffing the air for their prey. The heavy boots moved closer, crunching on the debris on the floor. They were seconds from being discovered. The margin for error was zero. Their escape route was not a window, but a wound in the boat's structure. The gaping hole in the back wall left by the collapsed roof, it offered a jagged, splintered opening out into the blackness. It was their only way out. Helen pushed Luke toward it. The night air that flowed through the opening was thick with the earthy smell of the swamp, a scent that now represented freedom. Below the opening was a 3-foot drop to the dark, lapping water of the bayou. And somewhere in that blackness, Pops was waiting in his pirogue. It was a blind leap of faith. Behind them, the footsteps grew louder, more certain. A beam of light danced dangerously close to their hiding spot. "Nothing in here!" one of the men shouted. Now they must be in the hull. The misdirection bought them a precious few seconds. Helen pushed Luke forward again, her hands firm on his back. "Go," she breathed, the single word a prayer and a command. "I'm right behind you." The fear of the jump was nothing compared to the terror of what was behind them. Luke swung his legs through the jagged opening, his jeans snagging for a moment on a splintered piece of wood. He tore it free. For a second, he hesitated. A dark silhouette against the faintly moonlit water. A boy on the precipice of a terrifying unknown. Helen could feel his fear, a cold wave that washed back over her. The rotting wood of the floor felt soft and treacherous under her own feet. A final betrayal from the boat that had stolen everything. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a small, steadying pressure. "I'm here," she whispered. The sounds from the main cabin were growing louder, the men's frustration turning to anger. They would find the open hatch to the hull empty, and then they would turn their attention to the back of the boat. Luke took a deep breath, the sound barely audible, and then he was gone, dropping from the edge into the darkness below. Helen held her breath, listening, her senses strained to the breaking point. She was utterly alone for a heart-stopping second, a target waiting to be found. A soft splash broke the silence, a sound that was both terrifyingly loud and blessedly quiet. Luke was in the water. Helen peered down through the opening, her heart in her throat. She could just make out his dark head bobbing in the water, his arms flailing for a moment before finding purchase on the side of a long, dark shape that had been hidden in the shadow of the houseboat. The pirogue, Pops, was there. A silent hand reached out from the small boat and helped pull Luke over the side, his movements swift and sure. Water streamed from Luke's clothes as he collapsed into the bottom of the canoe, gasping. A beam of light from the thugs' flashlight suddenly cut across the water nearby, sweeping past their position by mere feet. Helen ducked back instinctively, her heart hammering. They had seen the splash. They knew. "Over there!" a voice shouted from the deck. "They're in the water!" The hunt was on. It was her turn. Without a second's hesitation, Helen swung herself through the opening. The backpack, heavy with the weight of the gold and the logbook, threw her off balance. She dangled for a moment, her fingers scrabbling for a hold on the rotten wood, before letting go. She hit the water with a jarring splash, the cold a shocking, violent slap against her skin. The black water closed over her head, and for a disorienting second there was only silence, and the cold, murky pressure of the bayou. Her lungs burned. She kicked frantically, fighting her way back to the surface, the weight of the sodden backpack trying to pull her down. She broke through, gasping for air, the foul taste of the swamp in her mouth. Strong, wiry hands grabbed her by the shirt and hauled her, sputtering and shivering, into the pirogue. She collapsed next to Luke, her body trembling with cold and shock. The proximity of the houseboat, now crawling with her would-be murderers, was terrifying. She could hear them shouting on the deck above. "Stay low, and stay quiet," Pops breathed, his voice a low hiss in the darkness. He was a shadow at the stern of the pirogue, already pushing off from the houseboat with his long pole. The small craft moved with an impossible silence, gliding away from the wreck and into a narrow, reed-choked channel that was invisible from the main waterway. Helen huddled at the bottom of the boat, her arms wrapped around a shivering Luke. The cold from her wet clothes was seeping into her bones, but the adrenaline surging through her veins was a fire that kept the worst of it at bay. She could feel the solid weight of the ammo can inside the backpack pressed against her leg, a cold, hard reminder of what was at stake. They had done it. They had escaped. But they were not safe. They were in a tiny, vulnerable boat, being hunted by armed men in a swamp that was their territory. The feeling of relief was instantly swallowed by the cold reality of their ongoing peril. The sounds from the houseboat grew more distinct as they slipped further into the reeds. They could hear the thugs crashing around inside, their frustration boiling over into violence. There was the sound of shattering glass, of furniture being overturned and smashed. "They're gone! The boxes are gone!" one of them roared, his voice echoing across the water. "Find them!" Then, the deafening roar of the airboat engine fired up again, a furious, wounded scream that promised retribution. The powerful floodlight ignited, sweeping across the bayou in wide, frantic arcs. A beam of light passed directly over their heads, filtered through the thick curtain of reeds, painting a brief, terrifying lattice of light and shadow over them. Helen squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her face into Luke's wet shoulder, making herself as small as possible. She felt like a mouse hiding from an owl, praying the camouflage of the night would be enough. The engine noise moved away, towards the main channel, a temporary reprieve. Pops poled the pirogue with a skill that was nothing short of masterful. He navigated the labyrinthine waterways of the deep swamp without a sound, the boat gliding through the water like a phantom. The reeds and cypress trees closed in around them, a natural tunnel that hid them from the searching eyes on the airboat. The air was cool and damp, filled with the rich, loamy smell of the earth and the sweet scent of night-blooming flowers. For the first time, the bayou felt like a sanctuary, not a prison. It was Pop's territory, and he moved through it with the confidence of a king in his own castle. Helen could hear the soft gurgle of water against the hull, the gentle rustle of the reeds as they pushed past. The sounds were a soothing balm on her frayed nerves. She risked a glance at the old man. His face was a mask of concentration, his eyes fixed on the dark water ahead, reading its secrets in the faint moonlight. He was their silent, grim-faced guardian angel. After what felt like an eternity of silent, tense travel, Pops slowed the pirogue. Through a break in the trees, they could see back towards the open water. The houseboat was a dark, distant silhouette, a ghost on the horizon. The airboat was still there, circling like a shark, its floodlight a furious, searching eye, but they were too far away now, hidden too deep in the swamp's embrace. The thugs would never find them in here. They had escaped the initial trap. Helen looked down at the heavy backpack sitting between her and Luke. It contained a dead man's story, 2 bars of stolen gold, and the power to bring down an empire. The cost of carrying it had been immense. But the cost of leaving it behind would have been their lives. They were fugitives, soaked and shivering in the bottom of a canoe in the middle of a Louisiana swamp. But they were alive, and they had the proof. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since setting foot in this cursed place, they had a weapon, and they were finally running towards justice, not away from it. The dirt road felt impossibly solid beneath Helen's feet after the spongy decay of the houseboat. Pop's pirogue had vanished back into the reeds, leaving them on the edge of the wilderness with the weight of the backpack and a sliver of hope. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a clean smell that began to wash away the stench of rot and fear. A few minutes later, the distant rumble of a truck grew into a roar, its headlights cutting twin cones through the darkness. Helen's heart leaped into her throat. Was it them? But the engine was a sputtering diesel, not a refined purr of power. An old logging truck rattled to a stop, its brakes hissing loudly. The driver, a large man with a kind, weary face, looked down at the soaked, shivering pair. He didn't ask questions, he just opened the door. The cab smelled of sawdust, stale coffee, and motor oil. It was the most beautiful smell Helen had ever known. The cracked vinyl seat was a throne. As the truck lurched forward, she felt a single, silent tear of pure, exhausted gratitude roll down her cheek. The Greyhound bus station smelled of disinfectant and despair, but to Helen, it was a cathedral of escape. The ticket to Baton Rouge, purchased with a handful of damp dollars Pops had pressed into her hand, felt like a golden passport. The long ride was a blur of humming tires on asphalt and the endless drone of the engine. Luke Ice, wrapped in a thin blanket someone had given them, finally succumbed to an exhausted sleep, his head resting on her shoulder. Helen could not rest. She clutched the backpack on her lap, its weight a constant, terrifying and hopeful reminder of their ordeal. She could feel the sharp corners of the logbook's box and the dense, incredible weight of the 2 gold bars. Every time the bus slowed, her body tensed, her mind screaming that Beau's men were there. She felt a profound ache in her muscles and a hunger that gnawed at her stomach, but beneath it all, a fierce, cold fire was burning in her core. It was the fire of a mother who had seen the abyss and had clawed her way back out, carrying the evidence of its existence with her. Baton Rouge was a violent assault on the senses. After the deep, organic silence of the bayou, the city's cacophony of car horns, distant sirens, and the roar of traffic was a physical blow. The air tasted of exhaust fumes and hot concrete, a world away from the swamp's damp breath. Following Pop's gruff, parting instructions, "Don't go to the locals, go to the feds. They're the only ones Devereaux can't buy." They found their way to the Federal Justice Building. It was a monolith of cold, tinted glass and polished granite, designed to intimidate. Helen paused at the entrance, her reflection a pathetic, grime-streaked ghost in the dark glass. She felt a tremor of profound doubt run through her. Who was she? A bedraggled woman in wet, muddy clothes, smelling of swamp water, about to walk into this temple of power with a story so wild it sounded like a mad woman's fantasy. For a terrifying second, her courage failed her. She looked at Luke, his face pale but resolute, and knew she couldn't falter now. She pushed open the heavy glass door. The interior of the FBI office was colder than the bayou night. The air was sterile, conditioned, and unnaturally quiet. The only sound the soft hum of computers and the whisper of sensible shoes on pristine carpet. Helen felt impossibly small and dirty, a piece of swamp debris washed up in a sterile laboratory. She was acutely aware of the mud on her shoes, the torn sleeve of her shirt. the smell of her unwashed fear. They were led to a small, featureless room and left to wait. A man in a severe dark suit finally entered. He did not smile. He introduced himself as Special Agent Davies and sat opposite them, his face an unreadable mask of professional skepticism. Helen began her story, her voice a low, trembling whisper at first. She spoke of the ad, the wreck, the flooded hull, and the secret hatch. Davies listened with a kind of bored patience, his expression unchanging, his pen still. Helen could feel his disbelief like a physical wall between them, and the fragile ember of hope in her chest began to flicker and die. "I have proof," Helen said, her voice finding a sudden strength born of desperation. The agent's eyebrow raised a fraction of a millimeter. With trembling hands, Helen unzipped the backpack. She ignored the logbook for a moment. She reached in, her fingers closing around the cool, heavy bar wrapped in a rag. She pulled it out and placed it on the polished mahogany desk between them. The thud was not loud, but it was solid, definitive, and impossibly heavy. It shattered the sterile quiet of the room. Agent Davies stared at the dull, yellowish block of metal. He slowly reached out and touched it, his professional composure cracking for the first time. Then, Helen lifted out the rusted ammo can. She opened it and presented the leather-bound logbook. The smell of 30 years of rot, secrets, and murder filled the air-conditioned room, a primal stench of truth. Davies opened the book to the last entry. "He is here," and then looked back at Helen. The skepticism in his eyes was gone, replaced by a glint of something sharp, predatory, and intensely focused. The hours that followed were a maelstrom of controlled, quiet chaos. The single agent became a team. Other men and women in dark suits came and went, their voices low and urgent. The logbook was taken, its pages photographed with reverent care. The gold bar was tested and confirmed. Helen and Luke were moved to a different, more comfortable room, where they were given blankets, hot food, and steaming cups of coffee. The taste of the rich, dark liquid was a revelation, chasing away the last of the bayou's chill. A kind-faced female agent sat with them, taking Helen's full, detailed statement, her pen flying across the page. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Helen felt safe. The immense, crushing weight of the secret, the fear of the hunt, began to lift from her shoulders, piece by piece. She looked over at Luke, who was devouring a sandwich with a voracity that broke her heart, and she finally let go. A wave of bone-deep relief washed over her, and she began to sob, not in terror, but in pure, unadulterated release. They saw it on the news 2 days later, from the clean anonymity of a hotel room provided by the federal government. A local news channel broke the story with breathless excitement. The screen showed footage of a massive, pre-dawn raid on a sprawling, white-pillared mansion. FBI agents in tactical gear swarmed the property. Then, the money shot. A haggard, disheveled Beau Devereaux, his cream-colored suit now rumpled and stained, was led from the house in handcuffs. The mask of power and arrogance was gone, replaced by a look of disbelief and pure fury. The reporter's voiceover detailed the stunning allegations: racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy, and the official reopening of the 1989 disappearance and suspected murder of Jean-Luc Thibodeau. The Devereaux empire, built on a foundation of stolen gold and blood, was crumbling to dust in real time. Helen watched, her hand over her mouth, as justice, long delayed and almost forgotten, finally arrived with the force of a hurricane. The ghost of Jean-Luc could finally rest. The meeting took place a week later in a high-rise office with a panoramic view of the city. A federal prosecutor, a woman with sharp eyes and a compassionate smile, sat across from Helen. She explained the legal proceedings in clear, simple terms. The gold they had recovered from the houseboat, along with a much larger cache found on Devereaux's property thanks to the logbook's clues, was federal property. However, under the provisions for whistleblowers and crucial informants in criminal enterprise cases, Helen was entitled to a reward, a substantial one. The prosecutor mentioned a number, a percentage of the total seized value, and Helen felt the world tilt. The figure was astronomical, incomprehensible. It wasn't just enough to be safe. It was enough to be free, truly free, for the rest of her life. The nausea of poverty that had been her constant companion was replaced by a dizzying, terrifying vertigo of infinite possibility. Her mind flashed to a small rented house and an eviction notice. That life, that person was gone forever. 6 months later, the hum was the first thing you noticed. Not the desperate, rattling hum of an old singer fighting for its life, but the smooth, purring thrum of a top-of-the-line Bernina sewing machine. It sat in a room bathed in sunlight, a space that smelled of fresh paint, lemon polish, and brewing coffee. This was Helen's new studio, in her new house, in a quiet suburb, with green lawns and towering oak trees. The fabric beneath her fingers was not worn denim, but a bolt of deep blue silk, its texture a constant, luxurious reminder of how far she had come. The front door opened and Luke breezed in, waving a thick envelope, a smile, a real, unburdened smile that reached his eyes, split his face. "I got in!" he shouted. "Full scholarship!" Helen's heart swelled with a love and pride so fierce it almost hurt. She rose from her machine, her movements easy and light, and hugged her son. There were no ghosts here, no fear, no counting the last few coins on the table. There was only the warm, solid reality of a future they had earned. The evening sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose as Helen sat on her new back porch, a warm ceramic mug cradled in her hands. The gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the sound of children playing down the street. The bayou felt like a story she had read about someone else, a dark, harrowing tale from another life. The scars of her ordeal remained, not as open wounds, but as faint, silver lines of resilience, a testament to the strength she never knew she possessed. She had honored John's memory not by succumbing to grief, but by forging a new life from the very depths of despair. She had found justice for a forgotten man, and in doing so, had found her own redemption. The future was no longer a terrifying, unknown darkness, but a bright, open road. Helen took a slow sip of her tea, a quiet smile gracing her lips. She was home. Stories like Helen's, of falling to rock bottom and finding the strength to climb back out, are a testament to the human spirit. If you want to hear more tales of unbelievable resilience and unexpected justice, subscribe now and join our community.